On June 21st, 2000, deputies responded to the Calibre Bend Apartments in regards to possible human remains being found. On this day, one of the residents saw a couple of cats playing with something. He's like, what are they playing with? And come to realize it was actually a skull of a human. Later on, the anthropologists speculated that that person probably was there since about 92, 93. So we're looking at 7-8 years that this person was in this vacant lot. So at this point, it wasn't an intact torso that they had, it was bones. In this case, there was a hole in the skull that the doctors were very positive in saying was from a bullet. So this individual was listed as a unidentified human remains that died from homicide. At the time, the detectives did everything they could do, but without having victimology, they had no starting point. This recovery happened in 2000, like I said. We started doing a project about 2 years ago in the homicide unit with our cold case section, trying to get these individuals identified. The remains were sent to a company by the name of Othram. So Othram is a company that will take human remains, get DNA from those human remains that can be used in genetic genealogy that allow us to identify the human remains.
And through the Othram's forensic grade genome sequencing, they were able to develop a genetic profile, which was ultimately put into databases to search any potential relatives, and we got a hit.
We were able to finally positively ID the remains to be that of Paul Lawrence Rougeux Jr. He went by Larry. When Larry was murdered, he was about 40 years old. I had requested photos from the family, but the only ones that they could locate were ones of Larry as a baby and when he was in high school. Larry was born in '51. He grew up actually very close to where his remains were discovered, right off the corner of University and Goldenrod. His family had, at the time, about 12 acres. He would have attended Colonial High School, and he was believed to have been murdered around 1992 to 1993.
When you have an unidentified murder victim, the cases more often than not go cold. And then once the victim is identified, we're able to pick up right where we should have after what sometimes is a significant delay of decades.
When you have a homicide case, the most important thing that you need in a case is the victimology. You have to know where your victim lived, where they worked, who their friends were, who their family were, and we just need the public to come and help us. Who Larry would hang out with, where he would hang out, where he was working, and possibly where he was living. With that type of help, I know we can solve this case. We can give the family the closure that they need and deserve in this case. Any bit that even they might not think is important might be important to us. Any bit of information would help.
My name is Dolores Sykes, and Larry is my first cousin.
All right, and has your family always pronounced it Rougeux?
Well, we actually pronounce it Rougeux.
I wonder why we are in the media saying Rougeux when it's really Roger.
Because probably Rougeux is closer to the correct French pronunciation. I'm not sure that it's exactly the same as that, but it's closer anyway.
Okay. Well, what I want to make sure we do is pronounce it in the way that someone who may have never seen it spelled but may have known Larry would know him by.
That would have been Roger.
Larry Rougeux, or Roger, and we'll talk about that later, grew up in Orlando, specifically the Winter Park, Azalea Park area of Central Florida. As the Sheriff's Department video mentioned, there was a significant amount of time that passed between when his remains were found in that wooded area next to the parking lot of the Calibre Bend Apartments and when those remains were identified. That only happened recently.
2 years ago, I believe it was about 2020, I asked my wife, Megan, if she would like to know who her biological parents were. Megan was adopted by a great family. She never really had a desire growing up to know who her mother was or whatever. She knew who her mother was. It was Jill, the woman who adopted her. Mm-hmm. But Jill's passed. We had previously, several years earlier, taken some DNA tests, so we already had some clues with matching of other people. Within about 6 months or less, I was able to identify both Megan's biological mother and her biological father and several half-siblings, so on and so forth. And the biological father happened to be Paul Lawrence Larry Rougeux Jr. But I ran up against an NPE event doing the forensic genealogy.
In genetics, a non-paternity event, or NPE, is the situation where someone who is presumed to be someone's father is not in fact their biological father.
And it turns out that Paul Lawrence Larry Rougeux Jr. did bear that name, but his biological father was not Paul Lawrence Rougeux Sr. As I was putting together Megan's family tree, it became clear to me that Megan was in no way connected to any Rougeux person. And I start to think, well, we know that Paul is Megan's father, but she's not related to any of his people. So what does that mean? Right. And what I found was she was related to a bunch of other people who were from Buffalo, New York, which is where Paul's mother was from. And I started to put, the numbers together and found out that the non-paternal event happened before Paul's mother was married. She was with another man, and that other man is Larry's, Paul Rougeux's father. So we uploaded her raw DNA to GEDmatch, and within a month or two, we started to hear rumblings from Orange County in Florida.
Oh, wow. That was quick.
Yeah.
No one person's viewpoint on a family experience is the whole truth. The fabric of any family and experience is woven with the threads of each individual who lived it. But what if they didn't live it? What if they only learned that they were part of a family long into their adulthood because someone else along the line took a DNA test? What are the implications of applying DNA testing in genetic genealogy to the actual lived experience of a family?
From what we have surmised was that the kids that all hung out together, all these cousins that were born about the same time, had a relatively good childhood. They had fun and they all hung out together and stuff like that. But Paul Sr.'s marriage to Larry's mother was not good, and there was what seems to us to have been some levels of neglect of the kids. So one of the things that my wife, whose father is Larry Jr., and I talk about and try to figure out and try to have empathy and understanding about is this kid was not born the way that we know him. Something happened along the way.
Paul Lawrence Rougeux Jr., who we'll refer to as Larry, was born in October of 1951. By then, his father, who we will call Paul Sr., was a married man with a handful of kids already when he began a relationship with Larry's mom, Beatrice Healy. Paul Sr. and Beatrice would have 3 children, Larry and his sisters Catherine and Sandra, 2 of which were already born before Paul Sr. and his previous wife, Alice, were legally divorced the first time. They would actually go on to marry again years later, but Paul Sr. and Beatrice would divorce in the beginning of 1961. Larry was just shy of 10 years old. By 1964, Paul Sr. had purchased a home at 161 Oxalis Drive in Orlando, and that would be where he lived with his children for the next few years. The summer of 1965 would prove to be a seminal time in the life of 14-year-old Larry Rougeux. That home on 161 Oxalis was less than a half a mile from the home my next interviewee grew up in, and it is safe to say that he remembered Larry quite well.
My name is Robert, and I knew him as Larry Rougeux, not Rougeux, and I met him when I was 9 years old. My mother was kind of like the neighborhood den mother, and all the kids hung out at our house. The first time I ever met him, I came home from somewhere, and they were setting up to dance in our living room. and Larry had set a set of drums up in the corner, and he was the first drummer I ever met, and he was like 14 and already shaving at the time, and me being a 9-year-old kid, he was like my hero immediately. And he played along with some records. There wasn't another band there, and then they played music, and everybody danced. But that was the first time I ever met him. And I was just a little kid that got to, they got to watch or got to trail along. I wasn't really part of it. They would, tolerate me. When I was 9 years old and out playing in the backyard, I'd been in the house, and my mom's bedroom door was closed while other kids were in the living room doing something. And as I was out back, I just walked up to their bedroom window, and they had Venetian blinds, and I peeked through the crack in the Venetian blinds, and all I could see was the foot of the bed, but I could see feet, and I could see Larry's toes pointing down and Mom's toes pointing up on both sides. So even at 9 years old, I knew what was going on. And being the kind of guy that I am, kid that I was, I went into the house, picked the lock on the bedroom door, and just flung it open. And then a few months later, this was during the summertime, and then Thanksgiving, the day before Thanksgiving, we came up from school and Mom was gone, and had written a letter to each of us kids. And the way we were told was, she had a nervous breakdown, and she went back up to the Pacific Northwest to deal with it, to get therapy or to whatever. And she was gone from Thanksgiving to Easter. And then she came back. Now, the story that I'm certain my dad believed and what we always heard was she had an emotional breakdown, and that's where she went. Now, when my mom disappeared, that was the last that we saw of Larry. You couldn't mention Larry around the house. He was that son of a bitch, Rougeux.
It is in the couple of years after his relationship with this much older woman at 14 when we see Larry beginning to get in trouble with the law. At the end of April in 1967, the following article appeared in the Orlando Evening Star. A day at the beach resulted in a proposed trip to the Florida School for Boys for a 15-year-old youth in Orange County Juvenile Court. Paul Larry Rougeux of 161 Oxalis Drive admitted to juvenile judge Arthur Yergy that he had skipped school one day to go to the beach. The offense wouldn't have been so bad if Rougeux hadn't just been before Judge Yergy the month before on a petty theft charge, which resulted in a strict probation including school attendance. But 5 months later, he was back in front of the same judge again. The juvenile judge sentenced him to the Florida School for Boys after he disobeyed a court order sending him to live with his uncle in Buffalo, New York. The day he was to head off to New York, he got on a plane, but he got off in Atlanta, Georgia, and he turned around and came right back to Orlando, where he then stole a car at the Orlando Air Force Base. When he was brought back yet again in front of the judge, who asked him what he had to say for himself, Larry pleaded for one more chance. But this time the judge was unmoved. He said that Larry's actions, quote, spoke too loudly, and he sentenced him to the boys' school. By the time that he had just turned 16 and entered that school, Larry had fathered 2 children.
They'd be trying to get back home, and they'd be afraid, and they would cry.
Sonny and Betty Williamson remember the runaways, hiding in their yard.
When you see one of those boys that's run away, you see a little kid that's scared.
They were young escapees from the Florida School for Boys in Okeechobee.
They begged not to be taken back, that they'd be beaten, but to us a beating was maybe a hard spanking with a switch.
The punishment for running away was much, much worse, according to former student Joseph Johnson.
It was known among us that they would kill you. They would literally beat you to death.
I dug deeper and found out there's no question that boys did die during alleged escape attempts. In 1960, there was Cherry Black, a 13-year-old boy found dead in the school's sewage tank. According to the school superintendent, Cherry tried to hide in the tank and accidentally drowned in the sewage. That's the same story the coroner put on Cherry's death certificate. no autopsy was ever done. Marvin Mike, who is a student at the school, firmly believes Cherry's death was all a cover-up by the staff.
I think they killed him and threw him over in there.
Then there was 16-year-old Patrick Timmy Gabriel, who was shot dead during an alleged escape attempt in 1965. A coroner's jury ruled it a justifiable homicide, that Timmy had allegedly broken into someone's house wielding a knife and was shot and killed by the homeowner. Decades later, Timmy's brother went online, seeking justice, claiming it was all a cover-up, that his brother was shot perfectly between the eyes, and the family noticed many scars and swelling when they received his body for burial.
In a sworn affidavit that's related to a civil action against the Florida Department of Agriculture, Florida Department of Children and Family Services, Department of Juvenile Justice, Florida Department of Corrections, and 2 employees of the boys' school, Troy Tidwell and Robert Curry, a previous student described being sent to the Mariana facility, and shortly after his arrival, being sexually abused by Mr. Curry. He described in his affidavit being taken to the White House 3 times, made to lie on a cot with his face in a pillow, covered in what he described as vomit and blood and bits of tongue, and he was beaten with a leather strap. On a second occasion, he received a beating so severe, he says portions of his shorts were embedded in his skin. He described being beaten by 4 different employees of the school during the course of his tenure there, and that no student was permitted to have visitors for about a month after taking a beating like that, so they could heal up. He also said that he witnessed one of the employees repeatedly taking small boys into the kitchen to sexually molest them. Another student who signed an affidavit, who was 9 or 10 at the time that he went to the Florida School for Boys in the early 60s, he said that during one of his multiple beatings, he turned around to see his abuser with his pants down around his ankles, and he was masturbating. Both of these witnesses described incidents where boys were beaten to unconsciousness. One witness said that on an occasion when a governor of Florida at the time, who was called Leroy Collins, came for a visit, the students were ordered to cover up the White House and make it look like it wasn't being used.
The White House is probably the most infamous building on the Dozier School for Boys property. From what I have been told by former students, that building was reserved for the more brutal punishments, the punishments that they wanted to keep in hiding. A lot of sexual assault went on there. Beatings. There was a leather strap, and actually at the front of the White House, when you first go through the front door, you can see where the leather strap hung. The hook is still there. But everybody knew about it. And I'm almost positive that the entire town back then also had some inkling of what was going on, but the officials at the school who were involved would often refer to it, oh, the kids are going to the ice cream shop. So if you ever talk to any more students, some of them will actually refer to it as the ice cream shop, especially in later times, like maybe around the 70s.
Larry was released from the Okeechobee School for Boys in May of 1968. He was 17 at the time and was only home for a couple of months when the family home at 161 Oxalis was foreclosed on. However, it does appear that he was working a tiling job in some capacity, because he took his younger friend Robert to work with him one day.
So now, flash forward to when I was in the 8th grade, which would have been the late 60s. My mother had come back. She started working at Sears, and I think Larry came into Sears and ran into her. Somehow they met back up. So she brought him home one day, and then, of course, I idolized the guy, so I was real happy to see him. He hung out with the family. We did some stuff together. We went to Juniper Springs with my mom and, my sister and one of Larry's friends. And, she just became like a pal. Meanwhile, my father was working out of town. He was working in Tampa. So Larry became, a guy that hung around with us for a while. I remember him telling me about a heist he was doing where he was going to one of the local strip malls and stealing color TVs that night. Showed me, said, I got on my sneakers. There's a back way in. I've already got a fence set up to deal with them, and I didn't know what a fence was. He explained to me what a fence was. Here's a guy that'll buy the TVs from me and sell them. So to me that was like, wow, the balls on this guy. He had a Dodge Dart that was jacked up in the back, had big tires, the way I remember, nice car, and I rode in his car with him a couple times. The fastest I've ever driven in a car was with him on I-4. He hit 140 miles an hour.
Oh my gosh.
Like the first time I was in his car, just to show me how this thing could do. It had the big, had made all the cool sounds and all. And I remember he ran right up to 140 and then just let off and let it just to show me what it would do. And of course, and I was 14 years old, so I was pretty blown away. He took me to work with him one day. He asked me, if I wanted to come to work with him, and I went, yeah. He laid tile in some brand new apartments. But so we went to work, and I helped him lay tiles. I was like 85 pounds, so I wasn't a lot of help, but I did what I could do, and that's one of the other, fond memories I have with him. Now, how this all came to an end, he was hanging out at our house, and my father again was working out of town, and stayed up late one night talking to a girl on the phone during the summertime, and I got to drink a beer. My mom had bought beer and let me drink a beer if I stayed at home. I was 14, and in the middle of the night I got woke up with my father standing in the doorway, going, hey, it's me, it's your father. Well, you don't know who I am? And I was just, I just woke up. I had no idea what was going on. And then I remember there was beer cans out. Larry had been asleep on the couch. And, and now it's like, oh, my God, is somebody going to die here? Well, what had happened is my father came home unexpectedly on a Wednesday night. He usually just came home on the weekends. And for some reason didn't have his key and he looked through the window and saw what he thought was me sleeping on the couch. Because somebody was asleep on the couch, a black-haired guy, it's dark, and he assumed it was me, so he didn't want to wake me up. He went around to the bedroom window and tapped on the mom's bedroom window and said, hey, I didn't want to wake Bobby up. He's on the couch. So, come let me in. I don't have my key. So, of course, now Mom's like, oh, my God. And as she got up, she walks down the hall, passes Larry, and taps him and said, George is at the front door. Get at the back door. Get out the front door. So when she goes to let Dad in, Larry, grabs his clothes and darts out the front door and runs. I never saw Larry again after that. But in 1972, when I was a student at Colonial High School, Larry was evidently in the jailhouse downtown. The courthouse was right across the street from the phone building. There was a big municipal parking lot. And my dad was out in the parking lot feeding the meat or something, and Larry leaned out the jailhouse window and started yelling, hey, George, and waving, and he was up multiple floors. And then that was the last that I know of anybody that ever saw Larry.
Robert told me that he last saw Larry in the summer of 1969. It was only a couple months later, in November, that Larry would marry a girl named Erica. In 1971, Larry was arrested for possession and delivery of LSD, and he spent the next year out on bond. Erica's younger brother remembered Larry around that time as always being good to him. He said Larry took him fishing and to the races, and he picked him up from school on his motorcycle. But then, one day, his sister Erica and the baby that she and Larry had made moved back home with her parents, and he said that he never heard from Larry again. Erica's family couldn't afford to keep the child, so the little girl named Shannon was given up for adoption. Erica filed for divorce in the summer of 1972. The next year, Larry was charged and convicted with 6 counts of forgery, essentially check kiting. This also would have been a parole violation on his former charge. So in June of 1973, he was delivered to the Department of Corrections. Dear Sirs, Paul Rougeux has a parole hearing scheduled this month. I'm Paul's fiancé. I write also on behalf of his family. Although we were advised not to write until his hearing was imminent, our concern has been constant. Paul, prior to his arrest, had a good job at a steel company in Orlando. We were saving money to marry on and making good progress. Paul has been very anxious over the financial stresses at home. He suffers considerable frustration at being unable to help out. Most of our savings went when Paul's income stopped. His family would like to help, but practically speaking, they cannot. Being in effect supported by me and whatever his little sister can chip in is not having a strengthening effect on that precious self-respect that he was just beginning to learn. I liked the pride he was taking in fulfilling a responsible role, but I want him back before he loses that newfound faith in himself that he needs in order to try again. Paul isn't the first to have turned 21 before finally growing up. I think he'd agree he had some maturing to do, but I think he's getting there. We hope you'll review Paul's case. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely. In June of 1974, 23-year-old Larry began a work release program. He was employed with his dad at Citrus Floor Covering, and he returned to jail each night to the Orlando Community Correctional Center. In September of 1974, Larry was paroled. His first 30-day report read as follows. Subject requested and was granted permission to move during the reporting period. However, the move was not consummated due to some difficulties that he had with his father. On September 24, 1974, he called and stated that he was going back to work with his father the next day and would resume efforts to relocate. Mr. Rougeux, the owner, and his father became incensed at the subject's sister and put her out of the house due to a pregnancy, and this subject quit his job due to resentment. This difficulty has been resolved and the subject is back at work now. It is anticipated that this parolee will be a difficult case to supervise. The next parole report covered October through the end of 1974. He changed his residence during this reported time to the current address of 1901 May Street, which is an improvement, and he and his wife are living together compatibly in a low delinquency, modern income housing area. He was out of work for about a month, but kept in touch with probation, and they assisted in getting him employment as a welder. At one point, he was given permission to go to Virginia Beach, Virginia, to do some welding on large tanks that are used for carrying liquids. He was gone for approximately 1 week. Presently, he has a full-time job with A&A Rodar Service. So I want to mention that this wife that he now has was not the same woman who was calling herself his fiancée just a few months earlier. In fact, Larry married this newest woman in Virginia, coincidentally where he had gone to work on those tanks. He and this wife, whose name was Brenda, were living 16 miles northeast of Ocala in a frame house with 2 children. The report stated that Larry had moved there without permission. Since the subject's transfer to the Ocala area, calls have been received from members of the Sheriff's Department in Orange County, one relating to possible forgeries in which handwriting exemplars have been requested. Then his parole officer visited Larry's last known address, only to hear from the occupants that he no longer lived there, and they didn't know where he lived. The landlord who lived next door told them that he and his wife had split up, and they had both went their separate ways. The next year he caught a charge related to stolen property and violating his parole by moving without permission. This landed him back in jail. But to top that off, it was learned that Larry had committed a grand larceny while he was in Virginia Beach, and that was going to also have to be adjudicated. He was in Brevard County in 1977, and that year started with his legal divorce from Brenda. The notes also indicate that he was allowed in January of that year, 77, to be taken from Brevard County by an Orange County Sheriff's deputy to visit his grandmother, who was on her deathbed. However, this is curious because Larry's paternal grandmother, Bessie Rougeux, Paul Sr.'s mom, didn't die until 1985, and Larry's mother's mom, Catherine Healy, had died the year before. So who was the Orange County Sheriff's Office coming to pick him up and take him to visit? The timeline doesn't make sense because Bessie died in 85, so that was well after 77, and Beatrice's mom, who I don't even know that Larry had any relationship with, but she had already died. Is there anyone else in your family that he would have called grandmother who was on her deathbed around 77?
Not that I'm aware of, so that doesn't line up.
Was she ever a sick person? Like, did she get sick for any length of time where she would have been, on her deathbed? It uses the word deathbed.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't remember anything about anything like that.
And I would assume if he's being taken to someone's deathbed and it's your grandmother too, you would have been doing the same thing, would you not?
Yeah.
I never got an answer to that one. And it made me wonder, based on what was coming down the pike, whether that was a ruse or not, and the Orange County Sheriff's Department needed him to come back for something else. In the spring of 1978, Larry Rougeux found himself in Dade County, Miami, slated to be a witness in a murder trial that involved organized crime. This case was how he met his next wife, Donna. When they met, Donna was in the process of getting her law degree. The trial in question was that of former Key West policeman turned hitman Fat Sam Cagnina. He and former Key West councilman Terry Lee Garcia were accused of killing a man in 1974 during a battle to control protection for Miami Beach massage parlors.
Former Key West policeman Sam Cagnina and former Key West City Commissioner Terry Garcia allegedly murdered Ronald Yaris, son of reputed organized crime figure Donald Yaris. During the bond hearing this morning, the state's star witness was revealed. He's Louis Lorenda, a convicted drug dealer who is serving 18 years in federal prison. Only this month he decided to turn state's evidence. He testified that Cagnina admitted he used a .32 caliber pistol with a silencer to shoot Yaris in the head and neck at his Miami home in 1974. But defense attorneys argue that Lorenda made up the story so he could get out of prison earlier. The defendants, who have already pleaded not guilty to the murder, testify that if they were set free on bond, they would return for the February 6th trial. But Judge Ellen Morphonius denied bond. According to testimony, the two men plotted to murder Yaris because they wanted to take over several of his South Florida massage parlors. If convicted, they could each be sentenced to death. Bob Kaplitz, Channel 4 News, Dade Circuit Court.
Now, it's unclear why Larry was testifying for Sam Cagnina. My best guess is that he had crossed paths with a witness in the case, essentially making him a jail informant. He had been housed at Avon Correctional Facility at the same time as a man named Clyde Lee, who was serving a term for gambling, and old Clyde had been the unfortunate recipient of a hit ordered by Harlan Blackburn. Sam Cagnina was that hitman. Harlan Blackburn, known as the Colonel, was a big boss in organized gambling in Central Florida for years. Bolita was his thing, and Clyde Lee and Harlan Blackburn were gambling buddies. Well, until they weren't. Blackburn was also a known associate of Santo Trafficante Jr. of the Tampa Mafia. Harlan Blackburn, along with 60 others, were indicted on gambling charges in the early 1970s, and it was the first time RICO laws were used in a Central Florida case. Harlan Blackburn got a 22-year sentence in federal prison for gambling and tax evasion. Then he was indicted on conspiracy and aiding and abetting Sam Cagnina in the attempted murder of Clyde Lee. Blackburn had set it up so that he'd be in a phone booth calling Clyde Lee, who was in another phone booth. So a car goes by and emptied 4 bullets into him, but he lived, and another car pulls up next to Harlan Blackburn's phone booth and shot at him, so it looked like they were both targets, and it was initially reported in the paper that way. But conveniently, a milk truck had gotten in between Harlan and the gunman. In the end, the jury didn't buy that it wasn't a setup, and Harlan Blackburn was convicted. According to prison documents, Larry Rougeux was taken down to Dade County for a 2-month period between March and May of 1978 to be a witness for yet another Sam Cagnina trial. And what happened is that the first trial ended in a deadlock, and they were about to retry him when Sam Cagnina absconded.
The government charges this man, one-time policeman Sam Cagnina, has been operating a criminal brokerage house. He's accused of arranging contract murders and arsons to control illegal activities, stretching from here to Tampa to New York, even Europe. Cagnina is a fugitive. He failed to appear for a Miami murder trial yesterday. 12 persons are named in conspiracy and racketeering charges that include 4 murders, 2 attempted murders, 2 murder conspiracies, 3 arsons, 4 truck hijackings, counterfeiting of $12 million, and numerous narcotics charges.
I typify this operation as a group of organized criminals out committing any crimes they can to make money, whether it's narcotics, killings, committing arsons, or hijackings. Anything to make money through crime.
The strike force considers this to be among its biggest cases. Some people have been given immunity and new identities.
Harlan Blackburn was in Dade County during this exact same time, called to testify in a cop murder case. Although Cagnina was finally found, tried, and convicted in 1981, and he got 45 years, I don't know if Larry was a witness in that second trial, but he would have still been on parole in Virginia, so he would have needed permission to leave the state, if he was. By the time Harlan Blackburn got out of prison, Bolita wasn't really a thing anymore, and the Traficantes, well, they were now leaning more heavily into drugs. So Blackburn started dealing drugs too. In 1992, right around the time that police believe Larry was killed, Harlan Blackburn was charged with selling drugs out of his home at the Midway Trailer Park in Longwood, Florida, after a 2-month sting operation that ended with Central Florida's former mob king being arrested for the last time. Harlan Blackburn would end up dying in a Minnesota prison hospital in 1998. I bring up this drug angle for a couple reasons. Larry's very next prison progress report at the end of June 1978 said, quote, "There is information contained in the file that indicates this inmate is believed to be dealing in drugs." And that was the second notation in the file about Larry potentially dealing drugs inside. He had a previous arrest for the sale of LSD years earlier, and at the very end of all of the documents that were sent to me by the Florida Department of Corrections, once I sorted it all out chronologically, in an interstate compact office memo that was added to Larry's file, there was a handwritten line that read, "Special Agent Cooper, FDLE, drug agents, inquiring about case." There's no follow-up investigation noted, and at the time he was out of state, finishing up his Virginia parole. Now, it's possible that Larry may have never met any of these men or worked for them, but he was physically in the same place as 2 major players in the gambling and drug network in Central Florida at different points, and he was the type of offender who could have worked for someone like Harlan Blackburn, if drug dealing was how he chose to make his money in the 80s and 90s. His prison record said he had long been suspected of being involved in strong-arming, narcotics traffic, and loan sharking, and those are very organized crime-esque offenses.
She was very open and honest about that when I was young. So I always assumed that, that could definitely be a possibility. And so either he's a John Doe or he's in Whitsick, because that's, the options, basically, to me. And they are the ones that made sense because of his background and his history.
Right.
So, yeah. I know about Sam Cagnina.
Okay.
That's a pretty serious situation. And so she did, she was honest with me that, that's how they met, that this wasn't a great... she was a federal criminal defense attorney in Miami in the 80s. Come on.
Miami Vice is what we're talking about here.
It was straight up Miami Vice.
Right. In October of 1978, Larry wrote this letter. Dear Mr. Browning, Sir, when you interviewed me in June, you told me that you would call Mr. Paul Colwyn, supervisor of LCI, and that if I didn't have any DRs, you would recommend me for parole to the detainer I have in Virginia. I have no DRs, and I have submitted a parole plan to you in August of this year. Would you please review my file and advise me of your decision, as I would very much like to be in Virginia for Christmas of this year. I have done over 3 calendar years now on a $700 check charge. Please consider this when you review my file. I will patiently await your reply. Larry married Donna in November of 1978 while he was still incarcerated. A December parole hearing that Larry had been told he was going to get did not occur, but by February of 1978, they were putting together another parole investigation. Here is yet another pleading letter from Larry. Dear Sir, I am writing in reference to my current parole status. In June of last year, I was interviewed by Mr. Browning at this institution. At that time, he told me, in front of my classification officer, that he would call LCI in October of 78, and if I had maintained a clean, disciplinary record, that I would be released by Christmas of 78. Well, I didn't even see another examiner until this month, at which time I was interviewed by Colonel John Alley. Now this man has been my parole supervisor, and he could not even answer my questions, or if I had a detainer. He told me yes and no. He didn't know when they would hear my case. He didn't know when I would be notified. He stated that he didn't fully understand this new parole system, and this was said in front of witnesses. This man told me I was over the guidelines, but he has decided I should do more time. My matrix time range is 14 to 25 months. Total time served is 36 months, 14 days, for a charge of forgery of $700 that was paid back before I went to trial. Mr. Paul Rigsby evidently at least knows his job. He has given an earlier release date than mine to a man in disciplinary confinement doing more time than I am, with less done, and a more extensive prior record. Justice, you people have made a joke of it. If Mr. Alley has something personal against me, well, that's for him to worry about. I will never beg another examiner for a realistic parole date. I needed a parole before you people succeeded in turning me into a very bitter individual, filled with nothing but contempt for your system and anyone who supports it. I don't need parole 4 months from now, thank you. You can give it to someone who can afford it. I can't. It was not until May of 1979 that Larry was picked up in Pasco County Jail and transferred out of state, finally released from Florida to his Virginia detainer. Donna and Larry's daughter Jennifer was born about 6 months after he was released on parole. Because Virginia records are not available to request unless you live in Virginia, I don't know exactly when Larry hit the streets when he was released from jail in Virginia. I do know that Larry was able to conceive another child with yet another unknown woman sometime around August of 1980, and she was born in June of 81. He would have completely satisfied his parole with Virginia in February of 81, and his second child with Donna was born in October of 82. But by then he and Donna were already split.
I was asking something about him, and she said, you know what's crazy is that when I was little, she said she was driving me somewhere, and Miami is just in a constant state of construction, right? There's always word construction everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that she stopped at an intersection at a light, and there was construction guys all around, and she looked up, and it was the construction guy that stopped in the crosswalk and was looking into the car was my dad. And that he was staring into the car at us.
And she was certain it was him?
Yep.
Did he recognize her?
Yeah, it was clear. Yeah, that's what she's like. I know he saw me. She's like, and I'm pretty sure he saw you. This would be 86 to 88. He was in construction in Miami. Mm-hmm. I know that because Mom saw him.
Right. Sometime in the early 1980s, Larry was out and free. And the curious thing is that there are no more Florida incarceration records. And to me, that seems odd for someone who had never really had a period of his life where he wasn't offending. Maybe he was living in another state for a time. Maybe he was flying under the radar. But whatever occurred, by the early 1990s, Larry had come back to Florida because that's where he was eventually found, dead, in a wooded area next to the parking lot of the Calibre Bend Apartments in Orlando, right around the corner from the family property.
I would assume that the reason he ended up, or how he ended up back in Orlando, was his family.
Mm-hmm.
where he was found is so close to where the ranch used to be, my grandparents' property.
When LP and Bessie Rougeux purchased the property that they call the ranch, there were no buildings on the property. He and his brother Guy built the main house. It was originally 20 acres, and it didn't have a standard address. It was way out in the country, and they had a rural route box number if they got delivery at all. Larry's grandparents sold it to a couple called the Coles, and they lived there for many years, eventually selling it back to the family.
My grandfather died in 1990, March of 1990. So up until that point, he would have owned it. Because, of course, Grandma died 5 years earlier. However, he had sold chunks of it to different ones of the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe at that time, because Aunt Helen took care of Grandpa in his last few years, I'm not sure how many, that if she took care of him until he died, then she would get the rest of the property that hadn't been sold to the other kids.
I see. Okay. Now, would Larry have been close enough to anyone living on that property to live there, or if there were any property disputes, or if there were, essentially, because Larry was found so close to that property, I wanted to find out, was there anyone in his age group living on that property, any of his cousins?
Jerry did live there for a while. I don't remember how long. Cousin Jerry Zitzelberger, but he committed suicide in 88 on that property.
His obituary says he worked road construction, which could have essentially been something that Larry did also. And his address in the obituary was that family ranch property, and he had only he married another woman named Mary about a year and a half earlier, so right after he moved back, it seems like. Did you know this woman that he had married a year and a half before he passed away?
No, I found the information about them getting married, but I don't, as to my knowledge, I never met her or anything. She must not have been in the picture for that long.
I did try to track down the former wife of Jerry Zitzelberger, Larry's cousin who died at the ranch by suicide. She was a bit older than Jerry, and her name was Mary Senkovich at the time they married. She also continued to live in Florida well into the 90s based on address information that I could find. I found a picture of Mary playing an accordion in Winter Park for a Salvation Army collection station around Christmas time one year in the early 80s. I also found some pretty zany articles about her mother, who had actually hired a hitman when she was a grandmother, mind you, to kill the wife of a man that she would later marry. Interestingly, she wanted the hitman to kill the woman and make it look like a suicide. It remains unclear if she ever crossed paths with her husband's cousin Larry, but if she lived at the ranch with Jerry until he died in 1988, it's possible, and that would get us a little nearer to the time frame of when Larry Rougeux was killed. It is important to me when I try to tell someone's story to present it in a way that represents the whole human, not just the one who had brushes with the law and couldn't quite seem to get his shit together. We are all messy, confusing blobs of skin when it comes right down to it. All of us are just out here trying to make it in this world in the best way we can, day to day. The thing to remember, though, is that we all had different upbringings and support systems along the way. I think it's best to always approach any look into someone else's life with that in mind. You can't just say, well, I was able to do this, so they should have too. One not-so-great fact in this story is that Larry Rougeux left every single woman and every single child that he sired with not a single parting glance. Knowing that isn't about judging him, it's about being mindful of that pattern when you're trying to decide what led to him being found in a wooded area next to an apartment complex in Orlando with a hole in his skull. Most murder falls into one of three very broad categories: love, money, or revenge. There are offshoots, but if you look at most homicides, they'll generally fit into one or more of those. With love, well, I can already envision a scenario where Larry got himself into hot water, because if there's one thing that we've learned, it's that he was going to find some female companionship, and he was, apparently, not opposed to doing so with someone who was already encumbered. We seem to have this black hole between in the early 80s when he was out of both of his Virginia and his Florida probation, and then we have nothing, and there's also no arrest records.
Right.
So, and what's curious to me is why no family members even know what was going on with him in the 80s and 90s. Like, when you've ever talked to Kathy, did she suggest that she was even in contact with him in the 80s and 90s?
Well, yeah, she never specifically mentioned dates that I can recall, but she's made remark to the effect that anytime he ever got in touch with her, he stole from her.
Yeah.
And I had the impression that was, possibly during some of those time periods that we don't have any idea where he was.
I don't understand why there are no more arrest records. I find it hard to believe that he got out of prison, having lived there most of his life, and then just stopped offending. Like, he didn't even know how to take care of himself. He grew up in prisons and jails. So the prognosis for someone like that when they get out of prison is very low. Especially, he had training in welding and things like that, but he'd have to support himself. You're mentioning of him stealing, and then he stole from Jennifer's family too. That's another reason to wonder if anything like that happened on the ranch property, since it was literally around the corner from where he was found. And the way he was found there, the place he was found there, seems to suggest it was either someplace they just dumped him, or they walked into those woods for some reason and he was shot there. I don't see. Yeah. It doesn't look like he was like buried there. I don't think that. I think it was just a place to, either meet up with someone or to dump his body. Now I want to look at Larry's actual crimes. He started with skipping school and petty theft. He sold LSD. He forged some checks. He robbed stores. He had done a pretty long stint in jail for check kiting, and while inside he participated in a scheme involving a radio to pay a debt he had. He stole things even as far back as when Robert knew him, when he was just out of the school for boys. He knew what a fence was, and had one, way back when he was 18 years old. There's not a single violent crime among them, not one. Nothing physical against anyone else, so far as we know. And in none of his crimes did he use a weapon. There were no armed robberies or anything of the sort. But if at this point you're asking yourself, well, Jenny, then why should I even care what happened to this guy? Well, first, shame on you, because that's not nice. Second, there's no such thing as a perfect victim. He also did not have a stable day-to-day childhood. His father wasn't even his father, and he died never knowing that, although you have to wonder how that felt to him organically. If Larry knew in his gut that something didn't feel right, if he felt that he didn't fit in. And without going even further down a rabbit hole that doesn't matter, his biological father was also a criminal. His mother, in fact, got pregnant with Larry right before his biological father went to prison, and then soon after she married Paul Sr., who was the only father that Larry ever knew. Most of this story, obviously, and I told Troy this, my goal is to sort out Larry's timeline, who he was, what might have happened to him, but there's this obvious sort of linear storyline here that involves genetic genealogy and how that's uncovered more of his children. If you're comfortable, I want to hear about your thoughts on that dynamic, where you sit today with, learning all of this. What has it brought up for you? Anything that you think it's important for people to hear, whether it's listeners that have no relation to you, people that do have relation to you? What is it that you want to say about that?
Well, I would say that for the Rougeux, I am extraordinarily grateful that Dolores found me and found us and was able to, bring me into the fold, and that I felt for the first time in a very long time, especially because my mom had already passed away and everything. But Dolores finding me meant me having more than just my little brother as family, because we were all that's left. My mom was an only child, and I'm not close with any of my family in New Jersey, really. I've tried to be over the years here and there, but I didn't grow up around them. It's very difficult. And so having the Rougeux has been amazing for me, because it's this whole network of people that I'm related to, and that some of them kind of look like me, and I was able to, identify with them and get close to some of them, and it's been really wonderful, and it was a big deal for me, especially when it happened, because I had just gotten divorced, and my ex-husband's family, he's wonderful, and his family is amazing, but it did feel to me like I was alone again in the world with just my daughter, and I didn't want her to ever feel like she didn't have family on my side. But that's kind of how it felt. And I have built a family, a chosen family around myself, but it's different than having a sibling that you can rely on, or even, cousins and aunts and uncles and things. And so getting to meet them for the first time and having them be so welcoming and having them be so automatically like, yep, you're ours, that's it, you're in the family. I showed up to this family reunion in Pennsylvania and I can't explain how overwhelming it was, but they had every single person that had heard about me coming to this in advance had brought little gifts for my daughter. And it was, honestly, it was the sweetest thing in the world, because I felt really alone right then. And being able to feel not alone for a minute was really amazing and was really impactful for me. And just seeing all these people just take us in and just be like, yep, that's it, you're ours, and we looked for you. And to know that they looked for me was very overwhelming, but very positive for me.
So in answer to your question, why should I care who killed Larry Rougeux? You should care because your birth father wasn't a criminal, and maybe your mother didn't abandon you. And perhaps you weren't privy to a sexual relationship with an adult who should have known better when you were 14. If you didn't have all of those things happen to you, you don't know what the person coming out the other end was living with or living through. You're a decent person. What you do is you apply a liberal dose of grace, and you care because Larry Rougeux was killed, and his family has no idea by who or why, and they want to know. You care because someone who is willing to kill one person is most certainly capable of killing someone else.
Well, I appreciate you putting it out there, because as uninvolved as my dad was in my life, I also realized that, everybody has reasons for everything, and things happen, and life happens, and the most difficult part for me is I thought the closure would be there, just finding out he's a John Doe, and some of it is somewhat, but knowing what happened to him would mean a lot to me.
Yeah.
Because I've just, like I said, I've been searching for him for the last 30 years.
If you have any information that could help solve the murder of Larry Rougeux, please call Crimeline at 800-423-TIPS. That's 1-800-423-8477. Thank you all for listening. If you are a family member, friend, or member of law enforcement that is interested in having your case covered on the Down and Away podcast, you can contact me at deckerjenny@gmail.com. That's DECKERJENI@gmail.com.